The wind howled through the endless pines, carrying with it the smell of smoke and winter. Snow clung to the edges of the old cabin roof, and the fire inside hissed and popped, giving warmth to a man who had spent too many years in the wilderness. He sat near the hearth, boots drying on the floorboards, rifle resting within reach. Out here in the backcountry, far from towns and law, a man learned quick that peace never lasted long. The woods could be cruel, but they could also deliver strange turns of fate. That night, fate came in the form of a knock at his cabin door. At first, he thought it was the wind pressing loose wood against the walls. But then it came again, sharper this time, a knock that carried weight. No one came this far without reason. He rose slowly, hand brushing the stock of his rifle, heart beating steady but alert. When he swung the door open, the lantern light fell upon a figure that didn't belong to the storm. A woman stood there, shivering, wrapped in nothing more than torn cloth that clung to her frame. Her skin was pale from cold, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. She said nothing at first, only looked at him as though the cabin was her last chance. Snow gathered on her shoulders, her hair damp and tangled. He knew the woods could strip a soul bare, but he had never seen someone caught so raw by its hand. She swayed as if she might fall, an instinct overruled caution. He stepped aside, motioning her in. She crossed the threshold without hesitation, collapsing near the fire with a gasp that sounded like relief mixed with pain. The man shut the door, bolted it, and watched her carefully. Questions burned in his mind. What was she doing out here dressed like that? Where had she come from? The nearest town was days away by horse. People didn't just appear in the middle of the frontier unless they were running from something or someone. He poured her a cup of water and crouched nearby, waiting for her to speak. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of fire and the low moan of wind outside. Finally, she lifted her head. Her eyes were dark, steady now despite her trembling hands. She whispered that she had nowhere else to go, that the woods had chased her farther than she thought possible. Her voice was weak, but it carried weight, the kind that made a man know she wasn't lying. He didn't press her for details right away. Folks who showed up at a cabin door in the dead of night usually had a story too heavy to carry in one breath. He gave her a blanket, let her warm her hands by the fire. Still, his mind kept circling the same questions. She wasn't dressed for travel, not in this weather. Torn cloth didn't come from simple misfortune, it came from struggle, maybe even violence. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the firelight sharper. The man had spent years avoiding other people. Yet here was a stranger forcing her way into his solitude, not by strength, but by desperation. He had the choice to turn her out, to let the storm finish what had started, but the look in her eyes bound him. He couldn't turn her away. Outside, the wind shifted. He knew enough about the land to sense when silence carried danger. Coyotes howled in the distance, though their song felt more like warning than hunger. The woman flinched at the sound, pulling the blanket tighter. She seemed to know the woods were not just filled with animals that night. The man leaned back, watching her closely. He wanted to ask who she was running from, but something in him hesitated. Sometimes the wrong question at the wrong time could close a person off forever. Instead, he offered her food. She ate slowly, eyes darting toward the window as though expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. He noticed the bruises along her wrists when the blanket slipped. They weren't the kind made by branches or falls. They were the marks of someone held too tight, maybe dragged against her will. The man said nothing but inside his chest. The old anger stirred, the anger he thought he had buried when he left behind the world of men for the silence of trees. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew harsher. Snow beat against the shutters, the cabin groaning under the weight of wind. The fire's glow flickered across the woman's face, showing a mix of relief and dread. She had found shelter, but she had not found safety, not yet. Her eyes gave her away, the way they kept drifting toward the door as though she expected another knock, one far more dangerous than hers had been. He sharpened his knife by habit, the sound filling the silence between them. She finally spoke again, her words trembling as much as her hands. She said they would come for her. Not if they would. Whoever they were, she believed it enough to make her voice shake with certainty. The man set down the knife, meeting her eyes. He didn't ask the question forming on his tongue. Not yet. He only leaned back, listening as the storm howled louder, as though it too was waiting for the truth to spill out. She lowered her gaze to the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes like secrets she wasn't ready to tell. He knew then that his quiet life in the wilderness was about to end. The woods were full of stories, but some had a way of dragging you in whether you wanted them or not. This woman, broken and trembling at his fire, carried such a story. He could feel it pressing in from outside, heavier than the snow, sharper than the wind. When she finally lifted her head again, she whispered only a few words, enough to send a chill down his spine colder than the storm itself. Then silence fell between them, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. Someone was out there, moving through the snow, drawing closer to the cabin. The hoofbeats were faint at first, almost lost in the roar of the wind, but they grew steadier with every passing moment. The man sat without moving, his mind calculating. Out here, riders did not stumble upon a cabin by accident. They came with purpose. He reached for the rifle resting near the hearth, his fingers steady, though his heart quickened. The woman heard it too, her shoulders tensed, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her eyes fixed on the door as if she feared it might burst open at any second. The man studied her, searching for a clue, anything to explain what was about to happen. She did not meet his gaze, but the fear in her face told enough. Whoever was out there was not friend. He put a finger to his lips, a quiet warning to stay still, then rose slowly to snuff out the lantern. Darkness closed in, broken only by the glow of the fire. The cabin now looked less like a beacon in the storm and more like a shadow among shadows. The hoofbeats circled. He could hear them crunching in the snow, moving closer, pausing, then shifting again. Whoever it was, they were searching, listening, deciding. He tightened his grip on the rifle but did not open the door. Out here. Patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. He waited, counting each breath, each creak of leather and stomp of hoof. Finally, the sound began to fade, retreating into the storm. But the man knew better than to relax. Riders could circle back. Riders could lie in wait. The woman exhaled shakily, the tension leaving her body for a moment. Still, she didn't speak. She kept her eyes on the fire, as if afraid her words might summon the riders back. The man lowered himself to the chair again, watching her closely. He had learned long ago that silence often carried more truth than speech. He would wait for her to find her voice. Time passed, measured only by the hiss of the fire and the storm's fury against the shutters. At last, she began to talk. Her words came haltingly, each one heavy, as if dragging through mud. She said she had been taken from her home, far south of the valley, by men who lived by cruelty, not law. She never gave their names, and perhaps she did not know them. But she described the way they carried themselves, rough men, hardened by greed and violence, who had no reason to fear the wilderness, because they thought themselves its rulers. She had managed to escape, though she would not explain how. She only said she had run until her feet gave out, till the storm swallowed her, until the cloth on her back tore against branches and stone. That was when she found the cabin light and knocked. The man listened in silence. He had known men like the ones she described. In his younger years, before he built the cabin, before he sought peace in the woods, he had crossed paths with gangs who thought land was theirs to take and lives theirs to break. He had left that world behind for a reason. But now, with this stranger at his fire, the past seemed to be clawing its way back. Her story did not fill in all the spaces. Gaps hung between her words like shadows. He did not press her. Trust was a slow thing, especially when a person had been broken. Instead, he offered her more food and let her rest. She lay on the rug near the fire, eyes drifting closed, her body surrendering to exhaustion. While she slept, the man sat watch. He knew the riders had not vanished into the storm for good. They would come again, maybe tonight, maybe in the days ahead. Men like that did not give up icily. They hunted until the trail ended. The storm raged through the night, beating against the walls, but the cabin held strong. When morning came, the light was thin, pale across the snow. The woman stirred awake, her face still pale but calmer. She thanked him with a quiet voice, and though she tried to hide it, he saw how relief softened her shoulders. He stepped outside to split wood, scanning the horizon while his axe struck the frozen logs. The land stretched wide and silent, but silence was not safety. Tracks in the snow told him horses had indeed circled the cabin, then veered east. They were scouting, testing. He knew they would be back. When he returned inside, she was waiting by the fire. She asked why he had helped her, why he had not turned her away. He answered simply that a man does not leave someone to freeze in the storm, not when it is within his power to help. Her eyes searched his, as though she wanted to believe that simple kindness still existed in the world. The day passed slowly, the storm easing but leaving behind a cold sharper than before. He taught her how to tend the fire, how to use the old iron pot to heat broth. It gave her hands something to do, and he saw how it steadied her, how it gave her a sense of place. Yet beneath it all, the fear lingered. Every sound outside made her flinch. Every gust of wind turned her gaze to the door. By evening, when the sun bled red across the snow, she spoke again of the men. She said they would not stop because they believed she belonged to them, like property, like something to claim. The man felt a burn in his chest at her words, an old anger rising. He remembered why he had left the world of men because too often it forgot its own humanity. That night the hoofbeats returned. Not faint this time, but strong, certain, drawing closer. The man rose, rifle in hand, eyes hard. The woman clutched the blanket around her shoulders, staring at the door with terror and resolve. The cabin filled with silence, broken only by the steady beat of approaching horses. The riders stopped outside. Storm had gone still, as though the woods themselves were holding breath. A voice called out, rough and commanding, asking if anyone inside had seen a runaway woman. The man's jaw tightened, his finger brushing the trigger. The woman's eyes widened, pleading without words. The voice outside called again, louder this time, demanding an answer. Snow crunched as someone dismounted, boots striking the frozen ground. A hand thudded against the cabin wall, testing the strength of the logs. The man stood in the glow of the fire, rifle steady, his eyes locked on the door. The woman crouched low, clutching the blanket tight, her breath shallow. Tension thickened the air until it was almost solid. And then another knock sounded at the door. This one was not desperate like hers had been the night before. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind of knock that promised danger no matter what answer came. The fire flickered, shadows twisting across the cabin walls as the man waited. Heart steady, but mind burning with the knowledge that his quiet life had ended. The knock at the door lingered in the air like a warning. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't ask but demanded. The man did not move right away, kept his eyes on the woman crouched by the fire, her knuckles white as she clutched the blanket tighter. She shook her head faintly, fear written all over her face. She didn't need to speak. He already knew what she wanted him to do. Stay silent, pretend no one was inside, let the riders believe the cabin was empty. But silence could be as dangerous as words. The men outside were not the type to be fooled easily. They would circle, search, maybe even force their way in. He had seen that kind of arrogance before. He tightened his grip on the rifle and walked closer to the door, stopping just short of it. His voice carried steady and calm when he finally spoke, asking what business they had riding through the storm. The man outside laughed, a harsh sound muffled by wood and snow. He said they were looking for something, or rather, someone, a woman, thin, frightened, dressed in little more than rags. The man inside could almost feel the woman flinch at those words, though she made no sound. The rider went on saying she had run from her rightful place and that they aimed to take her back where she belonged. His tone was casual, but beneath it was a threat that soaked through the logs of the cabin like cold wind. The man inside answered carefully. He told them the storm had been heavy, but he hadn't seen anyone near his land. He spoke plain, without hesitation, though his heart beat hard in his chest. He knew these men would weigh every word, hunting for cracks. Another knock, heavier than before, made the walls shiver. The voice said they'd have to check for themselves, that the wilderness was no place for liars. The man raised his rifle, then aiming. It square at the door, as though the wood might vanish in a heartbeat. His words dropped low and sharp, telling them no one entered his cabin uninvited. For a long moment, silence stretched. Only the wind filled the space between inside and out. Then boots crunched in the snow as the men stepped back. The rider's voice came again, colder this time, saying they'd be watching. If the woman was inside, they'd find out soon enough. Then the hoofbeats returned, fading into the distance, though the man knew they hadn't gone far. Inside the cabin, the woman broke into quiet sobs she had been holding back. The man lowered the rifle, his jaw tight, his eyes hard on the flames. He knew the riders were right about one thing. The wilderness couldn't hide her forever. The next days stretched long and heavy. The woman stayed inside, too fearful to step beyond the threshold. She busied herself with small tasks, mending torn cloth with what little thread she found, grinding corn for bread, tending the fire. The man hunted and chopped wood, always returning with watchful eyes scanning the tree line. The forest felt different now, less like solitude and more like a trap waiting to spring. At night, when the fire was low, she spoke in whispers. She told him more about the men, though her voice always shook. They weren't just outlaws wandering the land. They had money behind them, ties to places where lawmen looked the other way. They were used to taking what they wanted and not being stopped. She had been their prisoner for weeks, maybe longer. She couldn't count the days anymore. The scars on her wrists told the truth even when her words faltered. The man listened, though he did not press her for every detail. He knew enough now. These weren't just riders, they were hunters, and they would not stop until they had what they claimed belonged to them. One evening, as snow fell in thin sheets and the sky glowed pale, he spotted smoke far to the east, too close to the tree line. It wasn't his fire, it was theirs. They had camped nearby, keeping watch, waiting for their moment. He said nothing to her that night, but his mind worked restlessly. The days built with quiet tension. Tracks appeared in the snow near the cabin, sometimes faint, sometimes bold, proof that the riders were circling, testing his patience, testing his strength. He laid traps along hidden paths, not to kill, but to warn him when someone drew near. More than once, he woke to the sound of steel snapping in the dark. The woman grew restless, her nerves wound so tight she jumped at the smallest sounds. In the midst of this fear, another conflict began to grow, not with the riders, but between them. She wanted to leave, to run farther, to find a town where she could hide among faces and walls. He told her it was too dangerous. The storm had only eased and the riders would catch her trail within a day. She argued that she couldn't stay forever, that she was putting him in danger by being there, answered with the same steady tone each time, that a man who opens his door doesn't turn his back on what comes through it. Still, the unspoken truth hung between them. Their lives had been tied together by chance, and now both were bound to whatever storm came next. At night, when she thought he was asleep, she whispered prayers under her breath, words that trembled but carried hope. He pretended not to hear, but deep down, her voice touched something he thought he had lost. He had come to the wilderness to escape the cruelty of men, yet here it was, knocking again on his door, demanding he choose between silence and action. The riders did not strike right away. They waited, drawing the tension tighter each day. Sometimes he would see one of them at a distance, a figure on horseback lingering at the edge of the trees before disappearing. Other times he'd hear their laughter carried faintly on the wind, meant to remind him they were close, meant to unsettle him. The woman began to change in those days. Though fear still lived in her eyes, a new strength flickered there as well. She watched how he moved, how he prepared the cabin, how he laid out plans with quiet precision. She asked questions, learned how to load the rifle, how to sharpen a blade. At first he resisted, but he saw the determination in her face. She didn't want to be helpless anymore. And so, a kind of bond grew between them, born not from choice but necessity. They became two against many, a fragile line holding back the weight of the storm outside. Still, the man knew time was running short. The riders would not wait forever. The longer they circled, the bolder they would grow. One night, as he stood at the window watching the tree line, he heard a sound that confirmed it. Not hoofbeats this time, but a whistle, a signal, sharp and clear. It came from one side of the woods, answered by another from the opposite side. They were no longer circling. They were closing in. He turned back to the fire, where the woman sat clutching the blanket, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for the truth he had kept from her. He finally spoke the words he had been holding back, telling her the riders were here, not tomorrow, not someday, but tonight. The fire popped, the shadows twisted, and for a moment the cabin felt smaller than it ever had before. The woman's breath caught, but she didn't cry this time. She only straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the storm to his door. Outside, the forest fell silent, the kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. The man loaded his rifle, his hands steady, his mind set. The conflict he had tried to avoid was now at his doorstep. There was no turning it away. The night pressed down heavy, the kind of darkness that swallowed the forest whole. The fire inside the cabin burned low, its glow flickering across rough-hewn logs and casting shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. The man stood near the door, rifle loaded, eyes narrowed at the silence outside. The woman sat on the floor by the hearth, her hands clenched so tight around the blanket that her knuckles had turned pale. Neither spoke. Words would have been wasted now. Both of them knew what was coming. A faint crunch in the snow reached his ears, so slight it could have been a deer, but the rhythm was too steady. Another sound followed, this one closer, a horse shifting its weight. He lifted his hand, a signal for her to stay low, and her eyes widened as she crouched deeper into the shadows. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the waiting, the sense that unseen eyes were studying every corner of the cabin, testing for weakness. He thought of his years in the wilderness, of nights when coyotes circled his camp, or when storms shook the roof like they meant to tear it apart. But this was different. Coyotes hunted for food. Storms followed their own wild path. These men outside carried intention, and intention was more dangerous than any beast. The whistle came again, sharp and quick, answered by another in the distance. He felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. They weren't wandering anymore. They were positioning. He imagined them spreading wide through the trees, rifles in hand, waiting for the right moment to close in. The woman whispered his name softly, asking what would happen if they broke down the door. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held something stronger, something like resolve. He told her quietly that if they came through, they would not leave unscathed. She nodded, her jaw set, as though she was ready to carry that truth no matter how heavy it became. The hours dragged like chains. Every creak of the cabin felt like a warning. Once, he thought he saw a figure move between the pines, but when he blinked, it was gone. The riders knew patience. They wanted him unsettled, worn thin by the waiting. To steady himself, he checked the traps he had set around the cabin. The thin metal wires and hidden snares would not hold men, but they would make noise if tripped. It was the only warning he could buy in this vast silence. He sat back near the fire, rifle across his knees, listening with every fiber of his body. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. She said she knew these men better than anyone. They would not attack with a rush. They would tighten the noose slowly, closing every escape until the cabin itself became a cage. She warned him that when they struck, it would be swift and without mercy. Her words carried the weight of truth, and he knew it. He had seen the marks on her wrists, the bruises that told her story better than she could. These men were no strangers to cruelty. They thrived on it. The night deepened and snow began to fall again, heavy and thick. The storm muffled sound, but that only made it worse. In the hush of falling snow, every noise was sharper, every crack of wood louder. Once, the sound of a branch snapping made the woman gasp and grip the edge of the hearth. The man only raised a finger to his lips again, his eyes never leaving the door. He remembered his past then, the years before the cabin, before solitude. He remembered standing in towns where lawmen turned their eyes away, where gangs rode in and claimed what they pleased. He remembered walking away from all of it, swearing never to be caught in the struggles of men again. Yet here he was, the past, circling back in the form of hoofbeats and whistles, demanding he choose between silence and resistance. Toward midnight, the first trap snapped. Sharp metallic twang cut through the storm. The man froze, listening. Then came a second, farther off, followed by muffled voices. They were testing his ground, mapping his defenses. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady on the rifle. The woman's breathing grew shallow. She leaned close to him, whispering that they would not stop. They had followed her this far through wilderness and storm. They would burn the cabin down if it meant dragging her from the ashes. Her voice cracked at the edges, but there was no doubt in her words. The man met her eyes, his own hard as stone. He told her simply that if they wanted to take her, they would have to come through him first. She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, her eyes glistening in the firelight. The storm raged harder, wind howling against the shutters, snow piling high against the cabin walls. Yet beneath the roar of nature, he could still hear them boots crunching, whispers carrying the restless snort of horses. They were out there, waiting, watching, like wolves circling prey. As dawn crept close, The storm broke. The silence that followed was sharp, brittle. Light bled slowly across the snow, pale and thin, but it revealed no figures near the tree line. Still, he knew better than to believe they had left. The riders would use daylight differently. Where night was for fear, morning was for strategy. The woman tried to rest, her head against the wall, but her eyes never fully closed. She jerked awake at every sound. She told him in a whisper that she felt like prey, and she hated it. She wanted to fight, to face them rather than wait. He told her that waiting was the fight, that patience was a weapon, and even as he said it, he knew patience would not hold forever. Tracks in the snow confirmed it when he stepped outside briefly. Hoofprints circled wide. More than one rider, more than two. They had been closer than he thought, closer than comfort allowed. He returned inside, bolting the door tight. The day stretched slow, filled with silence, broken only by the fire. Yet as the sun dipped low, a sound carried across the snow. A voice, clear, deliberate, cutting through the still air. It was the same voice that had called out days before, only louder now, more certain. It demanded the cabin open, claimed the woman belonged to them, that hiding her only brought misery for both of them. The man stood near the door, rifle in hand, every muscle ready. The woman rose too, her hands trembling, but her eyes steady. She said nothing this time, but her face said all he needed to know. She would not go back. She would rather face death than return to those hands. The voice outside called again, this time followed by the stomp of boots in the snow. Another voice joined, rough and impatient. Then another. They were gathering, their words sharp, their laughter cruel. The man knew what it meant. The waiting was over. Inside the cabin, the fire flared, the shadows deepened, and the woman pressed her back against the wall, staring at the door as if it might explode inward at any moment. The man steadied his rifle, his jaw tight, his mind sharp with the knowledge that the storm of men was about to break, and nothing he had done to prepare could stop what was coming. The hoofbeats grew louder, circling the cabin in rhythm, a drumbeat of war echoing across the snow.
Ow.
The voices rose, demanding, mocking, daring him to step outside. The woman covered her ears, but her eyes stayed open, fixed on the fire as though drawing strength from its light. The man stood tall in the center of the cabin, rifle in his hands, heart steady despite the storm building outside. The time for waiting was gone. The air thickened, charged with tension, until it seemed the very logs of the cabin might snap under its weight. And then the sound came, sharp and final, the crack of wood splintering as heavy boots struck against the door. The first blow shook the cabin, rattling the hinges, sending sparks from the fire. The second blow came harder. The woman gasped, the blankets slipping from her shoulders. He raised his rifle, eyes narrowing as the third blow thundered against the cabin door. The wood groaned, the latch shuddered, and the voices outside grew wild with cruel laughter. The storm was no longer waiting. It was here, battering at the walls, demanding to be let in. The door finally gave way with a violent crack, wood splintering under the weight of boots and shoulders. The man braced himself, rifle steady. The woman pressed flat against the wall, eyes wide with terror and resolve. Smoke from the fire curled thick in the room as shadows of men spilled into the doorway. They shouted as they surged forward, their voices rough and greedy. But their confidence was met with the sharp report of a rifle echoing inside the cabin. The shot rang out and the first rider stumbled back into the snow, his cry lost to the wind. Chaos followed. Boots pounded against the floor, fists hammered at the windows. The walls trembled with the fury of men trying to tear down the last sanctuary the wilderness offered. Yet the cabin held. Its logs were thick, its foundations strong, and inside it stood a man who had lived too long with silence to give it up so icily. The fight stretched deep into the night. There were shouts, the crash of fists against timber, the metallic clang of weapons meeting wood. The woman did not cower this time. She kept the fire alive, fed it when sparks dimmed, and when his rifle needed reloading, her trembling hands steadied enough to help. Together they held the line, not because the cabin was a fortress, but because their will turned it into one. By the time the last of the riders broke and fled into the trees, the snow was stained and the silence outside felt heavier than before. The man stood in the doorway, chest heaving, rifle warm in his hands. The forest was quiet again, save for the faint retreat of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The woman stood behind him, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She had faced the storm and lived, and in that survival, there was strength that hadn't been there before. When dawn finally broke, the world was hushed under a blanket of fresh snow. The cabin bore scars, splintered wood, shattered hinges, but it still stood. The man and woman both knew the riders might return, but not soon. They had been dealt a blow they had not expected, one that would make them think twice before circling back. In the days that followed, the woman slowly regained pieces of herself she thought were gone forever. She mended the broken door with his help, stitched torn fabric into blankets, and began to walk outside without fear gripping her heart. The forest, once only a place of dread, became a place of air and silence again. She learned the paths he took to gather wood, the way he read the snow for signs of life, the way the wilderness spoke if you knew how to listen. The man, in turn, found himself changed as well. He had built the cabin to escape people, to bury the noise of the world. But her presence reminded him that solitude could not shield a man from all storms. Sometimes the storms found you whether you opened your door or not, yet he did not regret letting her in that night. In truth, he knew he never would. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she told him the rest of her story. She had lived in a small settlement farther south, her family gone, her life reduced to surviving among those who saw her as little more than a thing to use. When she was taken, she thought her fate was sealed. Running had been desperation, not hope. Knocking on his cabin door had been the last act of someone with nothing left to lose. But he had answered, and that had made all the difference. He listened quietly, never interrupting, his eyes steady on the fire. When she finished, she asked him what had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. His answer was slow, but it carried the truth he had held back for years. He told her of violence he had once known, of towns where greed and cruelty walked openly, of the decision to walk away before he became a man he could no longer live with. The cabin had been his escape, his peace. A peace, he admitted, was not meant to last forever. The winter deepened, but inside the cabin warmth grew. She found strength in learning to live the wilderness way, and he found purpose again in teaching her. They hunted together, chopped wood side by side, patched the roof before more storms could find their way through. What had begun as a desperate refuge slowly turned into a kind of partnership. The memory of the riders still lingered like smoke after fire, but it no longer defined her. She spoke less of them as weeks passed, and more of what she hoped for: a life where she could stand free, where no man could claim her as property. He told her she already had that life now, and though his words were plain, they carried a promise she believed. By spring, the snow had begun to melt, streams breaking free of ice, and the forest waking with birdsong. The cabin still bore its scars, but it stood strong. The man and woman often sat outside on the rough-hewn bench he had built years before, watching the world stir awake. She would sometimes trace her fingers along the wood, whispering that she never thought she'd find a place that felt like home again. He would only nod, but inside, he felt the same. Their story was not one of grand victories or riches won. It was a story of survival, of a door opened in a storm, of two lives colliding when both had nearly been broken. The wilderness tested them, the riders threatened them, but in the end, it was their will to stand together that carried them through. The man knew the world beyond the forest had not changed. Greed and cruelty still thrived, riders still hunted, storms still rose. But he also knew that in this cabin, on this land, something had been restored. Humanity, trust, and the quiet strength of choosing to protect rather than turn away. The woman, once shivering in torn cloth, now stood with clear eyes and steady hands. She was no longer the desperate figure who had knocked in the storm. She was stronger, shaped by fire and trial, carrying her own story with pride rather than fear. As the last of the snow melted and the trees turned green again, the cabin door stood repaired, stronger than before. It bore the marks of what it had endured, just as they did. But it also stood as proof that even in the harshest wilderness, even in the darkest storm, light could be found when one soul refused to abandon another. In time, the riders became nothing more than shadows in memory. The man and woman carried on, building their days with quiet work and their nights with the steady warmth of firelight. What had begun in desperation had turned into something neither of them had expected: a life shared. Not out of fear, but out of choice. The cabin remained, tucked deep in the pines, a place of survival, of strength, of refuge. And though the world beyond still churned with storms of its own, within those walls there lived a truth worth remembering. That sometimes the smallest act, answering a knock in the cold night, could change the course of two lives forever. The wilderness held its silence once more, broken only by the rhythm of an axe striking wood, the sound of laughter carried on spring air, and the steady beating of hearts that had chosen to endure. And so, their story, born in the storm and tested by fire, found its ending not in despair, but in quiet resilience. A reminder that even in the hardest places, humanity could still take root and grow strong.